Hi, let's talk about ecosystems. So an ecosystem is the communities, all the communities that are of different species that are interacting, along with all of the non-living things or abiotic factors in that particular ecosystem. So we're going to talk about some of those things in this chapter, as well as energy movement in an ecosystem and nutrient cycling in an ecosystem. So an ecosystem could be large or small. And a very small one could be the space under a fallen log and all of the organisms that live there. Or it could be an entire side of a mountain, or a very large island could be a single ecosystem. We can have different ecosystems within a small area. Like if you were looking at different elevations on the side of a mountain, you might have numerous ecosystems as you move further up the side of the mountain with different temperature ranges and different species present. So no matter what kind of an ecosystem we're talking about, there's going to be a flow of energy, which is generally from the sun to photosynthetic organisms to consumers, and then to detritivores, and also chemical cycling within the ecosystem of carbon, nitrogen, water, etc. So energy is not created, and sometimes I hear people say, plants create energy. No, they are just transforming it from one form to another. So the process of photosynthesis takes solar energy and turns it into chemical energy and chemical bonds, starting with sugar, but then also making lipids and proteins and nucleic acids. So energy isn't created in this process. The second law of thermodynamics says that disorder increases. So every time you transform energy from one form to another, like from sunlight to the chemical bonds in glucose, and from glucose to muscular motion or muscle contraction, that process is not going to be efficient. And in fact, there's always some energy lost as heat when you transform energy from one form to another. The law of conservation of mass also says the same thing, that mass is not created or destroyed, but it is recycled through living systems. And so we're going to talk about a few elements that are cycled through ecosystems. We've already talked previously last semester in 1151 about the most important elements in living organisms, which is a small subset of all of the elements on Earth. Many of the most common elements aren't used at all by living things, like aluminum. Very common element, not used at all by living things. So the three elements down here are three of the limiting factors in growth in ecosystems, and we'll talk about them. Carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and then we'll talk about the water cycle as well. Trophic levels, which we talked about in the last chapter, autotrophs are the producers. They're the bottom of every food, I almost said food pyramid. They're the they're the bottom of every ecosystem, are the producers, and that's almost always we're talking about photosynthetic organisms. So whether it's plants or algae or lichens, anything that's photosynthetic is a producer. And the heterotrophs either eat the photosynthetic organisms or they eat other heterotrophs. So autotrophs, like plants, don't need to consume complex organic molecules. They can make them all from carbon dioxide and a few simple inorganic molecules. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, have to consume all of their energy by consuming other organisms, whether dead or alive, and have to consume those already synthesized molecules from which they make others. So we'll talk about that when we get to nutrition, that there are essential nutrients for all heterotrophs, but we'll talk about human essential nutrients, meaning things that we must consume because we can't make them. So the primary producers are the autotrophs, and in a terrestrial environment, that's mostly plants. In a marine or a freshwater aquatic environment, plants are not the majority of the primary producers. Instead, it is algae that is the primary producer in marine or aquatic environments. And also in marine environments, we'll talk a little bit about the bacteria that are chemoautotrophs. And the primary consumers are the herbivores, and we often forget about insects. We think about large herbivores like cattle or rabbits, and we forget about that most of the herbivores are, in fact, insects. Secondary consumers are the carnivores, and tertiary consumers as well, so are the top carnivores, which can eat herbivores and other carnivores. Detritivores, or decomposing organisms, these are heterotrophs. They get their energy from decaying dead plants or animals. Those are detritivores. They're extremely important for nutrient cycling. Without the bacteria and fungi that break down dead material, the whole all nutrient cycling would come to a screeching halt, because we would just be, piled with dead corpses of plants and animals everywhere. So decomposition, everything that dies eventually, if it's not completely consumed by another organism, it's going to decompose, and it will be broken down by bacteria and fungi. So this chart shows both the chemical flow, and so chemical energy, think pre-made organic molecules like sugars, proteins, and fats. That's chemical cycling. The energy flow it could be chemical bonds or solar energy. So if we look at the energy flow here, the energy for almost 100% of the ecosystems on Earth ultimately comes from the sun. Primary producers, whether it's plants or algae, and bacteria as well, there are photosynthetic bacteria too, are taking the energy from the sun and turning it into chemical energy. Herbivores are consuming those primary producers, and then carnivores are consuming the primary consumers. And everything, if it's not fully consumed, when it dies, it's going to be broken down by microorganisms. And every step of this transformation, because no energy transformation is 100% efficient or even close, that's what this is, these little wiggly arrows. Those are heat loss at every step of the process. So that means as we go down each step here, there's less energy available. And so we'll talk about that. So primary production is the total amount of energy that is taken from sunlight and turned into chemical bonds. That's primary production of any ecosystem. So almost all the ecosystems on Earth use photosynthesis for that process and sunlight. There is one type of ecosystem that does not use photoautotrophs, and those are ecosystems found in the ocean, too deep for any sunlight to penetrate, around volcanic vents called black smokers, and that's what this is here. And around these black smokers, there are bacteria that use hydrogen sulfide and other compounds as their source of energy. And other organisms in turn feed on those bacteria, so they are the primary producers. These chemoautotrophs are the primary producers of their ecosystem. But, this is a tiny, tiny percentage of the production on Earth. But, it's good to know that it exists, that not 100% is due to photosynthesis, but almost 100% is due to photosynthesis. So the global energy budget, so the total amount of solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface is enormous, and a very small percentage of it is actually used for photosynthesis. So there is a massive amount of sunlight that could be used by humans for solar energy that is not being utilized at all. So we would not have to be concerned at all about erecting enormous solar energy gathering devices like in the desert, because there's no shortage of solar energy. Photosynthetic organisms only use even just a tiny portion of the sunlight that strikes the Earth. So the total production, so the amount of mass that's generated. So remember, when photosynthesis is occurring, they're taking carbon dioxide and turning it into sugar. And so they're producing mass. And so that is production. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the production of an ecosystem. So the gross primary production is the total amount of mass that is produced by photosynthesis. But that's not the most important number to worry about. The net primary production is more important to ecologists, because that tells us the amount of new mass that's being created. And that means that's so the amount of new mass that's being created, that's the amount that's available for herbivores to consume. So net primary production is the more interesting number. And it turns out that there's an enormous variation in the net primary production. And as you might imagine, ecosystems that have a huge amount of plants, like tropical rainforests, are very productive, whereas places that don't have as many plants, like deserts, are much less productive. In fact, tropical rainforests and coral reefs are the two most productive ecosystems in terms of the amount of sunlight being converted into biomass. Marine ecosystems are generally less productive because a huge amount of the marine ecosystem is not very active at all. But then we have these coastal areas that with coral reefs, those particular areas, and also marine estuaries, which is shallow wetlands near the marine coast, those are also extremely productive. So if we look at an estimate of net primary production, so this is from satellite data, this is a composite from satellite data, just based on the amount of sunlight absorbed. So it's not a direct measurement of productivity. Instead, what it is an estimate based on sunlight absorption. So the more plants there are, the denser the forest growth, for example, the more sunlight is absorbed and the less that's reflected back into space. So that's what this is measuring. So if we look here on our key here, so the lighter the colors from green to yellow to orange to red, that's higher net productivity. That means that more sunlight is being absorbed and it's not reflecting back into space. Now, this method is not at all accurate for the oceans at all, or for any body of water. So just ignore the oceans in here. It's not a good way of estimating that. But it is a good way to estimate it for terrestrial environments. So let's look here. So if we look at North America, we can see that the eastern United States is more productive than the western United States, which makes sense because most of the western United States is drier. It's not all desert, but you can see the short grass prairie regions here to the in the western side of the Midwest are drier, and so they're less productive. Down here in Central America and South America, we can see extremely productive areas. This is mostly in Brazil here. The Amazon rainforest, extremely productive. The Sahara Desert here in North Africa, you can see that is very, very low productivity, as we would expect for a desert. We also have, Saudi Arabia is mostly desert, Gobi Desert, very low productivity. The Arctic and the Antarctic, also very low productivity because there's not much sunlight being absorbed in those areas. If there's a lot of open ground, like open sand and rocks, that's going to reflect a lot of sunlight back into space. That's going to indicate that there's not a lot of plant material there. If we look down here, we have Papua New Guinea, and the western half is Papua something else now. The whole thing used to be Papua New Guinea 30, 40 years ago, and now it's been divided into two countries, Papua New Guinea on the east and Papua something else, I can't remember. But this entire region here is a huge mountainous island covered with dense forest. Very productive. This is Borneo here, also very productive. Madagascar as well. You can see the eastern edge of Madagascar, also quite productive, in sub-Saharan Africa as well. This is very densely forested area here as well. And then in South Africa, it's more desert-like again, so productivity is relatively low. And look at most of Australia is relatively low with a little bit of productivity along the coast. So the net ecosystem production, now we're talking about not the entire production of a region, but we're talking about just one ecosystem. And the best way to measure it would be to actually measure the carbon dioxide and oxygen flux. So the more carbon dioxide is consumed and the more oxygen that's released, that indicates photosynthesis. Because remember, two things are happening in photosynthesis. CO2 is being absorbed and turned into sugar, and water is being broken down for its electrons, and oxygen is being released. So measuring one of those two things would give you an indication of the amount of photosynthesis that's going on, which gives you an indication of productivity of a particular area. And it's interesting that the amount of oxygen in our atmosphere, which is around 20% right now, used to be much higher when the Earth was warmer than it is today. 50 million years ago, all the way back to 200 million years ago, the Earth was warmer than it is today. And the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere was higher because the amount of the total mass and productivity of plants was higher. And so by some estimates, the oxygen in the atmosphere was as high as 30 to 32%. And that's just due to photosynthesis. So primary productivity in terrestrial ecosystems is mostly about rainfall and temperature. Now, of course, that wouldn't matter for a marine ecosystem because it has as much water as it wants all the time. So temperature would be more important for that. And also sunlight. So shallower areas for marine ecosystems tend to be more productive because there's more sunlight. If you get much beneath about 100 meters deep in the ocean, there's barely any sunlight at all for photosynthesis. So for terrestrial, the warmer it is and the wetter it is, the more productive it tends to be. And for marine and other freshwater ecosystems as well, the warmer it is and the closer to the surface it is, the more productive it is. So if it's very deep in the ocean, it tends to be quite unproductive. Shallow coastlines in the marine ecosystem tend to be more productive than deep ocean. So this is a graph just comparing productivity versus annual precipitation for a terrestrial environment. So as the annual precipitation increases here on the x-axis, so does the productivity up to a limit. So you can see it's approaching a maximal limit here for whatever the temperature is. And the only way to increase this limit would be to increase the temperature, which we might be doing with global warming. So limited nutrients, if particular nutrients are in short supply, that's going to reduce the productivity of a particular system, because if plants can't get enough nutrients, they're not going to make as much biomass. Generally, carbon is not limited. There tends to be abundant carbon. Carbon might be limited in the CO2 might be limited in aquatic ecosystems, but the atmosphere is not limited in CO2. Nitrogen in a terrestrial ecosystem is most commonly the limiting factor. That's why it's the most important thing that is found in commercial fertilizers is available nitrogen. Phosphorus can also be a limiting nutrient that also tends to be present in commercial fertilizers. So there is lots of nitrogen around. Our atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, but it's in the form of N2, which plants cannot use. Animals can't use it either. The only way that it can ultimately be used by plants is if bacteria transform it into ammonia and nitrate, and then the plants can absorb that. And nitrogen is, of course, essential for making proteins, because amino acids have an amino group on them. Nucleic acids also have amino groups. So nitrogen is essential. Without nitrogen, enough nitrogen, plants can't make amino acids, they can't make proteins, they can't make DNA and RNA either. So that's very important. There are bacteria that have developed a symbiotic relationship with plants and form and live in these little root nodules on certain species of plants. We'll talk more about that in the plants section. Secondary production is everything except the producers. So secondary production in an ecosystem is how much biomass we can add of all the other things, all the herbivores and the carnivores. How much biomass and chemical energy do they have? That's secondary production. And generally, that's pretty predictable based on the primary production of an ecosystem. The only time it gets weird is when you're looking at some marine ecosystems. So efficiency is very important, and we're going to talk more about metabolism and metabolic activities in when we get to the animal section. But for example, so insects tend to be very efficient compared to other animals in terms of turning plant material into animal body. So that's efficiency. So what is the efficiency of taking food and the mass of the food, like 1 kilogram of food, how many kilograms of animal matter does that contain? And so a caterpillar, which is a pretty efficient animal, only about 1/6 of that, the chemical energy found in its food, is going to end up as new caterpillar body. So that's the efficiency. So for example here, and the J here stands for joule, that's a unit of energy. So if we have 200 joules of energy in the leaf that the caterpillar is eating, about 100 joules of that, or about half, the caterpillar is just going to poop out. It's not even going to use it. And about 2/3 of the rest is going to be used just for cellular respiration, just for maintaining the cells the caterpillar already has. And only about 33 joules are going to be used to produce new caterpillar biomass in terms of growth. So that's, and this is actually a really efficient animal. We are much less efficient than this. We use far more of our energy for cellular respiration. Birds and mammals, because they're endothermic and maintain a constant internal body temperature, our efficiency is only about 1 to 3% of turning the material we eat into body mass. Fish are a little bit more efficient because they're not endothermic. They're generally the same temperature as their surroundings, and so are insects and microorganisms. And they tend to be a bit more efficient. They use less of their energy on respiration, on maintaining the bodies that they have. So trophic efficiency is how much energy is transferred as we move up in trophic levels from one level to another, from producers to consumers to carnivores, and it's usually pretty low. It's around 10%. So that means only about 10% of the biomass that's consumed from one level is going to be turned into new biomass in the next level. So that's pretty low. And so this means by the time you get up to a tertiary consumer or a top carnivore, only about 0.1% of the chemical energy initially fixed by photosynthesis is going to turn into biomass in that tertiary consumer. So that's the reason why the further up you go in the trophic pyramid, the rarer the organisms become, because there just isn't enough energy available. We couldn't have a species of carnivore that depended on eating the top carnivores, because there's so little energy, there would be so few of those individuals that they couldn't survive. No species could be dependent on eating lions, for example, because there just aren't enough of them. They're already the top carnivore. So so you can see here, each level we lose 90% of the energy in that biomass as we move up in our trophic pyramid here. So at the top, so tertiary consumers, the top carnivores tend to be rare. And our herbivores are less biomass than the primary producers, and the secondary consumers that are eating the primary consumers are less biomass, and finally the top carnivores are the smallest biomass in the ecosystem. And this would be, how they measure it is dry mass, but we're not going to be, I think that seems kind of obvious that that's how they would measure that. So the higher you go, the rarer things become. Also, the top carnivores tend to be larger, and so they're going to be even fewer of them. So this is for a terrestrial ecosystem. The exact numbers here were measured in an experiment from a bog in Florida. But this is, basically what you would find for any terrestrial ecosystem. Lots of primary producers, fewer consumers. And the smaller the number of primary producers, the fewer things you find as you go up. So think about the difference between a forest, where you have massive amounts of primary producers, and a dry chaparral forest or a desert. You're going to have, if you shrink the number of primary producers, everything else is going to shrink, because as you go up, you lose 90% of the available energy in terms of how that's going to convert to biomass in the next level. It gets a little weird with some aquatic ecosystems. Now, this wouldn't be true for the kelp forest that we see in the documentary, My Octopus Teacher. In that case, we have a very large primary producers, the large green algae that are on the bottom that kind of look like lettuce leaves, and then the kelp, of course, which is another type of algae. They're not phytoplankton. They're not plankton. So in that case, we would see a relationship closer to what we see for terrestrial. But for a lot of aquatic environments, there isn't any bottom primary producers, because there's not enough light reaching the bottom. So the primary producers are all planktonic. They're all small, floating around in the water column. And in that case, they often get eaten at such a rapid rate that although they are where all the energy is coming from, if we actually measure their mass, they seem to be in small numbers. And that's just because it's just a little bit different kind of an ecosystem when you don't have fixed primary producers stuck to the bottom. producing and having plenty of sunlight. When you have like deeper water, they're all going to be planktonic primary producers. And so we call that an inverted pyramid. So again, that depends on how deep the water is or how murky the water is. If the water is either very murky or very deep, in that case, all of your primary producers are going to be small and they're going to be floating closer to the source of light because they're photosynthetic. Decomposers are hugely important, and the rate of decomposition and nutrient cycling, again, depends on temperature and the amount of water. If you have very dry conditions, like in a desert, that's going to slow decomposition. If you have cold temperatures, that's going to slow decomposition. If you have too much water, like in a marsh or a bog, where you end up with stagnant, shallow water and very low oxygen levels at the bottom, anoxic environment, that's also very bad for decomposition and nutrient cycling. So it's very complicated. So this was a little study that they did in Canada, where they looked at the percentage of mass that decomposed in a year and compared it to the temperature. And so they found a very direct relationship between the average annual temperature and the percent of the dead plants that were decomposed in a year. If it was very cold, very little of the plant material decomposed. And in fact, these lower temperature areas here, there's permafrost. So that means below a certain level, you have no decomposition at all because it's permanently frozen. So rapid decomposition, like in a tropical rainforest where you have the right amount of water and warm temperatures, it actually means that there's less nutrients available in the soil. So tropical rainforests, although they have super abundant life, often the soil in tropical rainforests is rather thin and can be nutrient deficient because the nutrients are just leaching out and being sucked up by all the plants and used extremely rapidly. If it's too cold or too wet, like this is this picture here, this is a peat bog in Scotland. The dying plants actually pile up in this acidic, anaerobic, boggy water, and they don't decompose. And that's what peat is. And for several thousand years, humans who live near peat bogs, which they occur in several places in the world, have harvested out these blocks of peat and burned them like firewood because it's undecomposed, compressed plant material. So let's talk about some of the nutrient cycling. So some of them have a gaseous portion to them. So carbon and carbon dioxide, that's a gas. Oxygen, sulfur, nitrogen are in the atmosphere and also take different forms in the soil and in the water. Some are considered less mobile because they don't have a gaseous portion of their cycle, and that would be things like phosphorus and potassium and calcium, which are mostly leaching out of rocks, ending up in the soil, and then leaching out and running into groundwater and into marine environments. So the amount of these varies enormously depending on the local conditions. And when we're thinking about these different nutrients, we have to think about availability, not just are they present, but are they available to the organisms? And in some cases, they are present but not available. So things that are locked up in rocks are not available. Things that are dissolved in water or dissolved in the air, available. Other things that are sequestered underground in other ways, like for carbon, for example, carbon that's locked up in peat, under peat bogs, it's not available for photosynthesis. Coal and oil are also fossil organic material. They contain a lot of carbon. It's not available. And This brings up this unavailable, a term that we've been hearing a lot lately in relation to environmental concerns, and that is sequestered carbon or carbon sequestration. We want to sequester carbon. So sequestered carbon, if you sequester something, anything, it means that you have hidden it and it's not available. So if we sequester carbon, that means that we have taken it and put it into a form, like turned it into some kind of a rock and buried it underground. It's not available. So people have tried to come up with various schemes to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, turn it into some kind of a rock, and then bury it like calcium carbonate and bury it in the ground so that it's no longer available and it's not going to be affecting global warming. None of these has been particularly viable at this point, but that's what that means. It means that it's unavailable. It's underground or it's in rocks and it's not available. It's not in the atmosphere and it's not available to living organisms. The water cycle. Something that most people don't know is that almost all of our water on planet Earth is in the ocean. 97% of Earth's water is in the ocean. It's salt water. It's not available as drinking water. It's ocean water. 2% is locked up in glaciers and the polar ice caps. Only 1% of Earth's entire supply of water is fresh water that people could potentially get at to drink. 1% of Earth's water is found in freshwater lakes, rivers, and groundwater. So groundwater is what you would pull up with a well. That's groundwater. We are lucky here in the Midwest. We do not have any sort of a water shortage here. We live in fairly close proximity to the largest freshwater lakes in the world. So we don't have any concerns about water conservation at this time, except for, if you use a lot of hot water, some kind of energy is heating up that water. So let's look at the water cycle here. So water evaporates from bodies of water, and when ocean water evaporates, the salt does not evaporate. So just the water evaporates. The salt stays in the ocean. Rain is the way it comes down. So evaporation, precipitation, which would be rain or snow or sleet, whatever. The atmosphere moves water around. There's a lot of water in the atmosphere at any given time. And then a very small percentage of that water is percolating through to groundwater in rivers and in lakes. But most of it, 97%, is in the ocean. And that's not even counting the amount of water that's in the atmosphere at any given moment, which is probably quite a bit as well. Carbon cycle. So CO2 is the form, most carbon that's in the atmosphere. There's also methane in the atmosphere, but plants don't use that. So photosynthetic organisms don't use methane. There are some bacteria that do, but we won't worry about that. So photosynthetic organisms are pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. There's dissolved CO2 in the water as well, in the ocean and in freshwater. Photosynthetic organisms that are in those aquatic environments are also using that CO2 and turning it into organic molecules. So it's not CO2 anymore. That carbon is turned into first sugar, then proteins, then lipids, and then those molecules are consumed by heterotrophs. Now, eventually, those molecules get turned back into CO2, either by respiration in those heterotrophs. So we exhale more CO2 as we are consuming those organic molecules for energy. We exhale CO2. Decaying plant and animal matter in the ground, the bacteria, the detritivores, are also releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. So that's basically the carbon cycle. So what we want to do to reduce global warming is to reduce the amount of CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere or increase the amount of CO2 that we're taking out of the atmosphere, or both, because we want to reduce the total amount of CO2 on the in the atmosphere because it tends to hold heat in. So there are natural sources of carbon dioxide besides heterotrophs exhaling and things decomposing. Volcanic activity also releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And in fact, it's thought that is the reason for the significant warming of the Earth at the beginning of the age of the dinosaurs that lasted for 200 million years, is because of volcanic activity released a huge amount of CO2 into the atmosphere. The Earth warmed up, plants went crazy, and eventually the plants pulling that CO2 out of the atmosphere and not completely decomposing eventually sequestered enough carbon underground in the form of fossil fuels, and coal and oil, that the Earth cooled and we started having ice ages. So photosynthesis is removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Things that are decomposing, things that have respiration and aren't photosynthetic, like animals, are exhaling CO2 back into the atmosphere. And we are also releasing sequestered carbon that has been underground for millions of years. We are burning it and releasing it back into the atmosphere, where it hasn't been since the age of the dinosaurs. Okay, the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen is important because it's necessary for making amino acids and proteins and nucleic acids. So without an adequate supply of available nitrogen, plants can't make those things. Excuse me. So, but the N2 in the atmosphere is not available to plants. So bacteria convert the nitrogen in the atmosphere into ammonia and nitrate, and those can both be taken up by plants. Animals can only use organic nitrogen. And organic, remember, in chemistry, organic means it has carbon. So when it says animals can only use organic nitrogen, that means not this form. These ammonia and nitrate are not organic nitrogen because there's no carbon here. So organic nitrogen would be in the form of amino acids, pieces of amino acids, something with carbon still attached. DNA and RNA that's consumed in the food. That would be organic nitrogen. So we can't use ammonia or nitrate to make amino acids. We have to consume all of our nitrogen in an organic form, meaning it's already bound to a carbon, at least one carbon in the form of an amino acid. So here's the nitrogen cycle, and you can see that it's somewhat complicated. So we have lots of nitrogen in the atmosphere, which, interestingly, the nitrogen in our atmosphere is coming from bacteria. So almost 100% of our atmosphere is coming from living things. The oxygen in our atmosphere is being released by photosynthetic organisms. The nitrogen in our atmosphere is being released by bacteria in the soil. And a lot of the rest, carbon dioxide, is being released by animals respiring. So the composition of our atmosphere is due to the constant action of living things. So think about that when you watch a science fiction movie and they get to some lifeless planet and then they say, oh, we can take our helmets off. The atmosphere is 20% oxygen. No, it wouldn't be. That absolutely would not be. That bugs me every time I see that in a science fiction movie. Okay, so fixation of nitrogen also has to occur in an aquatic environment as well, because aquatic photosynthetic organisms also can't use N2, and they have to have ammonia or nitrate in order to use it to make amino acids and nucleic acids. The phosphorus cycle is generally, if you live in an area where the soil is fairly fertile, phosphorus is not as big of a concern, although it's enough of a limiting factor that it often is also present in commercial fertilizers. Phosphorus is mostly being weathered out of rocks, and it's found dissolved in water, and it also can be from guano, from bird guano. It also could be harvested that way. But and then it leaches into the soil and then leaches into the water. Phosphate, if you remember your structure of DNA and RNA, phosphate is critical to making nucleic acids. So organisms can't make DNA or RNA without phosphate. So this would also be a limiting factor in soils where it was in short supply. And again, if we limit the primary producers, if we limit the photosynthetic organisms, if they don't have enough phosphate, they don't have enough nitrogen, there is less plant biomass for the consumers. Restoration of degraded ecosystems has become of great interest in the last 50 years. Before that, nobody really cared about restoration. In fact, until the 1970s, even the US government, with the help of the Army Corps of Engineers, was still actively degrading and deliberately degrading ecosystems, draining wetlands, because it was not understood how beneficial these are for humans and for other organisms. So restoration ecology and restoration in general means that we're trying to return some kind of a damaged ecosystem back to a previous, more natural state. So an abandoned farm, we're going to turn it back into tall grass prairie. Or an abandoned mine, we're going to turn it back into a prairie ecosystem. So that's restoration ecology. And two methods that might be used would be bioremediation and biological augmentation. Both of these, you can tell by the bio root in there, it means we're going to use living things to have a particular function in some kind of restoration. So this is an example that your textbook uses. This is a open pit mine. Luckily, it didn't involve any toxic metals or byproducts, which many mining operations leave behind, toxic ponds and slag heaps. This was a mine that was mining clay and gravel, so there wasn't any toxic byproducts. But because it was an open pit mine, it pretty much destroyed a huge ecosystem. And so when the mine was abandoned, they wanted to restore it. Now, of course, if they had just left it and done nothing, eventually the ecosystem would have recovered, although it would have been a much slower process. So in only 10 years, they made a huge difference. So active remediation can help an ecosystem to recover much faster than it would on its own. So they changed the surface to make it less flat to help with water flow. They brought in plants and planted trees and tried to restore the ecosystem like it was before. And they did a pretty good job, although probably it's not completely back to what it was before the mine, because there's no mature trees, you know, that would have been there before. Another thing that happened all over the world, wetlands used to be considered to be a waste. Wasted land, useless areas, places that if only we could drain all this water, we could turn them into farmland and make them productive. And so there were projects all over the US and all over the world over the last few hundred years to actively drain wetlands of all types. And one of the ways to drain a wetland is to dig a canal through it. And that increases the rate at which water drains, and that will dry things out considerably. So this is an example from Florida. Florida is, as you might know, quite flat, and it used to be about half to 2/3 wetland of some kind. And of course, people can't live in a wetland very easily, so there was an active effort to drain most of the southern 2/3 of Florida by digging canals all over the place. And this was done by the Army Corps of Engineers to improve Florida. And what happened was, when you do that, when you drain it, it's devastating to the wildlife. And the land that you end up with, this drained former swamp, it turns out the bedrock in Florida is porous, old fossilized coral reefs and limestone. And so now there's sinkholes all over the place, because when the groundwater goes down, because you drain the wetland, now you have these fragile bedrock that's like Swiss cheese that can just collapse in on itself because there's no water in there anymore holding it together. So one of the things that they've been doing is getting rid of some of these canals. And this is what you can see here on the Kissimmee River. This is the former canal, and they allowed the canal to fill with silt and even dammed it up at one end to allow the river to kind of go back to its former meanders. And you can even see here some scarring back here of an old meander of the river. Rivers naturally will change where the riverbed is periodically. If there's a flood, when the flood goes down, the river may have a new course or a slightly new course, and that just happens. So getting rid of flooding completely is often very damaging to wildlife, and it often reduces the fertility of farmland. One of the reasons the Mississippi River Valley has so much fertile farmland is because of periodic flooding that happened, for the last 10,000 years. And now we have created dikes all over the place on the Mississippi River to keep it from flooding, and that's caused farmland to become less fertile. So this is going on in the Everglades as well. There's canals that were dug all through the Everglades to try to drain it in southern Florida, and a lot of those have been eliminated as well. The same thing in Louisiana, in the bayou in Louisiana, they did the same thing. They dug canals and tried to drain it, and that turned out to be a terrible idea too. And so they're trying to restore that as much as possible. Bioremediation means that we use a living thing to fix some kind of a problem. And it often means detoxifying something, or maybe not detoxifying, but there are plants that will absorb salt or heavy metals. And then sometimes those plants can be removed and to get rid of a heavy metal. One of my favorite examples of bioremediation are the oil-eating bacteria, which are now actively used when there's a marine oil spill, including the one that was in the Gulf of Mexico, the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, which was about 8 years ago, 6-8 years ago. There are species, and this is one, this Alcanavorax borkamensis, that's what this is here. It is a bacteria that can eat crude oil, and they sprayed it on the surface of the ocean and on beaches where the oil spill was, and they will eat it up and turn it into non-toxic compounds. So that's an example of bioremediation, because we're using a living thing to detoxify or clean up something. Biological augmentation is similar, except we're adding something to the ecosystem that is going to help. And one of the most common kinds of biological augmentation would be to plant nitrogen fixing plants like legumes in an area that has low nitrogen, because they have root nodules and nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they will increase the nitrogen content of the soil. Another kind of biological augmentation, if you're trying to grow trees someplace where there aren't trees now, where maybe there were trees there 200 years ago, but it's been a farm. Trees depend on mycorrhizal fungi. We'll talk more about those too when we get to the plant section. And if you plant trees where there aren't any trees right now, the right fungi might not be in the soil. And that will mean that the tree will be stunted in its growth. So one of the suggestions I heard was that if you're planting a tree, if maybe you're where you live used to be a farm, and there aren't any big trees, maybe no trees, that you should find a healthy forest somewhere in northern Illinois, dig up a bucket of soil from around a few trees, and bring that home and put a few shovelfuls of that soil in with your newly planted trees to make sure that the appropriate fungi is present for the roots in your newly planted tree. Okay, so that is the end of ecosystems, and the next chapter we will talk about conservation.